Hello again, everyone. I'm very pleased to moderate the fourth session of the day. The session will address the question, how do the impacts on notions of responsibility that have been found measure up to the original concerns about geneticization? And we have two excellent presenters. First, we have Paul Martin, who is, professor of sociology in the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield. Dr. Martin is the former director of the University of Nottingham Institute for Science and Society and currently conducts research at the interface of science and technology studies and medical sociology. After Dr. Martin's talk, we will pass it over to Carlos Novas. Dr. Novas is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. He teaches in the field of science and technology studies. His research interest includes biopolitics, the life sciences, biotechnology, patients, organizations, and bioethics. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Martin.
So I just want to check you can see my slides.
Yes.
And there
Perfect.
we go. Does that work?
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I must apologize first. I returned from holiday an hour ago and I'm still rather in holiday mode. So I've been listening to the fantastic conference as we've been going at the motorway on my mobile phone. So I've been following events, but I'm maybe not quite as sharp as I would be normally. But thank you very much for the organizers, for Lucas and Eric and the other organizers for inviting me to come along. I'm going to present something a little bit different. I'm a medical sociologist, normally doing empirical research, but I'm going to present essentially a conceptual piece here. This follows on from an article that my colleague Kate Binder led, but I was co-author on about geneticization, which is I think why I got the invitation. And I'm going to explore my thinking in particular that's evolved since that article was published about 4 years ago. So the aims of the talk are about the changing ideas of genetic responsibility, and this is in the context of the co-evolution of technology and norms. And in particular, I want to elaborate the idea of regimes of normativity. So this is the idea that norms co-evolve with technical change. And I want to try and chart in a very general way what I regard as some of the changes that are occurring, both in relationships to the technology, but also in terms of the norms associated with rare diseases. So in particular, I want to use this idea of the monogenic regime, and I'll explain what that is in a minute and give a brief history. So this is a bit of a historical sort of overview. Some of the details you may disagree with, and this is still very much early work in terms of elaborating this. It's not written paper, though I've written something specifically on regimes of normativity that we may refer to. And I'm interested in the shift in focus from, I think, in a lot of genomics, from common to rare diseases. And again, I'll explain what I mean by that. And finally, that's about describing changes in this normative, in this monogenic regime from biological to therapeutic citizenship. So I'm making a social theoretical argument based on some overview analysis of what I think is going on in the field and trying to relate this to changing ideas of genetic responsibility, the themes of this meeting. So I'm not going to define genetic responsibility. It's just a standard definition that Kate's given here. That's been elaborated at great length and in fantastic analytical detail during the meeting. But I suppose I want to argue that genetic responsibility depends very strongly on geneticized notions of disease etiology. And that's a point that's been made repeatedly by a number of the contributors to this event. And I think the link between the geneticization thesis and notions of genetic responsibility are central problematic. To what extent the geneticization thesis stands up, if you like, in general, to some extent determines the generalizability of, or the extent to which we can talk about genetic responsibility more generally. So that's part of the argument. So just to summarize, when we wrote this paper, we were dealing with the geneticization debate as expressed by Abby Littman in 1991. And this is seeing genetic science as leading to many aspects of human identity, health, and everyday life being explained in genetic terms. And what we did, Kate did, well, we did together, was reviewed the empirical analytical literature on this topic and concluded that relatively little of the original claims of the geneticization thesis have been realized. So this is a bit of a sweeping generalization, but if you read the article, you'll see that we've been quite careful to analyze the full spread of different interpretations of the geneticization thesis, and that was our conclusion. And so you might draw from this that there was a limited impact of genetic responsibility outside specific domains, and I'll talk about those domains in a minute, due to this lack of a strong link between genes and common diseases. Now, there is a link between genes and common diseases, but it's not perhaps the one that was initially anticipated by the geneticization thesis. And we can say, well, that was naive, perhaps historically, but I want to say, tell a story about how these ideas have evolved over time. Now, before doing that, I'm just going to touch on a model of sociotechnical change that I want to use to try and analyze this relationship between changing norms and broader sociotechnical change. So within science and technology studies, within SDS, there was no clear distinction made between the social and the scientific, or the technological. So we can think about the analysis of sociotechnical systems as being composed of new knowledge and technological artifacts, or organizations and actors that produce knowledge, and the infrastructures, the physical, market, and financial regulatory infrastructures that govern the use of that knowledge. But I think critically importantly, we can also talk about the sort of social, cognitive, and cultural dimensions of those sociotechnical processes. And I've drawn on, I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, I've drawn some literature which is about transition studies and so-called multi-level perspective. And I just want to highlight that the sort of place of analysis is at this regime level. This is at a meso level. So this is not talking about the sort of grand changes in biomedicine overall, or in the very detailed changes in the clinic. This is trying to make a general analysis at this level of a regime. And I'll explain what I mean about that in a minute using an example. So the elements of a regime, these cultural, cognitive, social dimensions, which accompany the sort of hard technological infrastructures and artifacts, can be summed up here. So in addition to the knowledge, artifacts, actors, organizations, and infrastructures, a regime includes the rule set or grammar that constitutes and govern technologies, skills, corporate culture, artifacts, embodied institutions and infrastructures. So this is talking about, if you like, the social, the softer stuff. I don't want to make this distinction really, but to give you a feel of that. And what Martin Pickersgill initially sort of elaborated in relationship to science, and I've elaborated further with Ilka Turkman-Darg in a paper that's coming out next year in New Genetics and Society, is this idea of a regime of normativity. So this is about the co-evolution of systems, technologies, norms, regulations, and future expectations. And it has a number of dimensions, which might include the beliefs, the ethical principles, the informal rules and formal regulations, the routines and institutional practices, and what we call the techno-moral imaginaries, the future expectations. So the argument here is that technical change, socio-technical change, in this case, in the area of genetics, involves not just the introduction of new artifacts, but it also involves changes in this regime that have these different dimensions, these beliefs, these norms, these rules, routines, and expectations. And by analyzing those, the way they change over time, we can see the co-evolution of technology and norms. So I'm just going to give a very brief story. This is rather superficial about, if you like, the development of genetic medicine, in particular related to rare diseases, and make an argument about how that has changed over time and its contemporary changes that are affecting the norms that govern this domain. So, and again, most of you will know all about this, origins in classic genetics, clearly, the development of the idea of monogenic diseases, the rise of clinical genetics and specialist services in the post-war era, particularly around genetic testing, particularly prenatal testing for these rare diseases, they're inherited in families, the link to genetic counseling, and that inspired the first hunt for genes for cystic fibrosis, for example, in the 1980s. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know there. I'm just saying this is the context I want to talk about. That's the sort of background to this argument. And I want to argue that the monogenic regime of normativity that was associated with the development of the early days of genetic medicine, very much what we've been talking about today. In terms of beliefs, it's about a genetic basis of etiology for disease causation, genes cause disease, the special status of genetic data, a certain set of norms about genetic responsibility, which is what we've been discussing and analyzing today, notions of genetic privacy, the rules and regulations that sort of control that. So we can think about data protection as one of those sorts of practices, routines and institutional practices as well, genetic counseling, and the techno-moral imaginaries are related to that, this expansion of screen and prevent. So I want to argue that this set of this regime of normativity, these, if you like, the sort of grammar of the system, including the sort of normative principles that govern behavior of actors in this particular space, co-evolved with these emerging clinical practices, these emerging technologies. And that is where the idea of genetic responsibility was born, and to some extent has remained, I would argue. So my historical take on this would be that we're attempting to expand this monogenic regime in the sort of 1990s, perhaps early 2000s. Early genomics was very much governed by the search for genes that were strongly associated with common diseases. And BRCA, I think, was the paradigmatic poster child of that era. So I think, some of the early genomics companies and the early biobanks were predicated on the idea that we would find fairly strong links between single genes often and these common diseases. As we know, this was disappointing. There's early results in that period. There were very few genes that were strongly linked to common diseases. And there was a big debate about this missing heritability. So the expected findings from twin studies that these diseases would be strongly inherited did not turn out to be the case. And again, I'm not saying anything new, but I think this is important as a story that the monogenic regime provided the template for those early expansion of genomics in terms of the assumptions about how this would progress. So as we move from genetics to genomics in the 2000s, we obviously have this massive expansion in human gene sequencing, next generation sequencing, GWAS. So today we've got over 10,000 GWAS studies. We move to multi-omics and the introduction of genomics as a broad enabling platform, diffused across many areas. So I don't think there is a specific regime of normativity related to genomics per se. I think it's very much domain specific. So we move to the present time and we think about what's been going on over the last few years. So bring my story forwards, if you like, that despite massive search for genes found that play a major role in common diseases, there's still a lack of progress in that sort of sense. Now, most people have probably abandoned this. So there's ongoing debate in the literature about the role of genetic factors in common diseases, the role of common or versus rare variants. Is quite a technical sort of debate about the relative contribution of these very rare variants to common diseases, or whether it's really common variants that contribute to them. I'm not going to go there. I'm not fully qualified to talk about that, but I can read the literature. There's been very few genetic tests for common diseases that have anything like the sort of power of the BRCA test outside oncology, and now you have somatic mutations that's slightly different. And I think a limited expansion of geneticized disease etiologies. I think we've moved to a much more complex interactional model between the genes and environment, basically. So I think that's broadly speaking where we're at. I think many of the discussants at this meeting would probably agree with that, certainly in terms of the way they've framed their contribution. I want to make an argument then that we're now seeing a bit of a shift. And this is because I've started looking much more at orphan diseases and orphan drugs. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But I think there's a series of converging developments that have led to an expansion of this monogenic regime associated with rare diseases in recent years. So I'm not saying that any of the things I've said so far are now being undermined. I think this is still restricted to talk about rare diseases that have a monogenic sort of basis in a single gene normally. But I think the development of whole genome sequencing and gene discovery, tests for monogenic conditions, orphan drugs and gene therapy, and rare disease patient activism through these rare disease patient organizations has changed the dynamics and this evolution, if you like, of this monogenic regime is now moving in quite a different direction, perhaps where we might have thought it was going in the first place. So I'm just going to give you a few overheads that summarize some of the empirical evidence for this. We can question this. As I say, this is rather provisional, but it gives you a flavor for the argument. So whole genome sequencing, again, you'll know it's being rolled out in many countries. The UK is leading, I think, the world in terms of the adoption within its healthcare system. So we've established the UK NHS Genomic Medicine Service, which is going to sequence 500,000 new genomes in the next 2 or 3 years. And the focus is very much in 2 areas, is on rare diseases, is on cancer, on somatic mutations. There's also proposals for large-scale screening of children, firstly in the context of where they have unknown diseases that may have a genetic etiology, but perhaps more generally. And we're seeing this massive ramp up in terms of capacity, sequencing capacity. So certainly in the UK, the commitment to screening, sequencing whole genomes and linking that to rare diseases is very much part of the central push within UK genomics. As one of the results of this is this increasing number of genes discovered. So again, this is no surprise. This is the characterization of genes that have increasingly their function is understood and may form the basis for either elaborating disease pathways, particularly rare disease pathways, if they're rare variants, but also the basis of tests for some of those rare variants as well. So I'm going to skim over this very quickly. If we look at the number of genetic cancers, this is in the United States, we've seen a steady growth in this. So more people involved in this work as a result of the sort of screening programs and tests that are being introduced, particularly prenatal ones. If we look at the growth in orphan drugs, so the argument I want to make here is that we're seeing a shift from an emphasis on diagnostics to also including therapeutics. And I think that's the key event that's going on here. So orphan drug legislation has been very successful over the last 20 years, and increasing the number of products each year. It's interesting that something like 40% of all new drugs approved by the FDA in recent years have been for orphan drugs or drugs with orphan indications. And they're increasingly starting to represent a very significant part of the global pharmaceutical market. So that's predicted to be something like 20 to 25% of the global market in the next few years. And that's particularly true in the United States. That's by value. We're also seeing the growth in gene therapy. Again, not going to go into this in any detail, but the key point is here that most of the gene therapies that are being developed at the moment are for rare conditions, broadly defined, often cancers. So we're seeing a growth in therapeutics, both orphan drugs in general and gene therapies in specifically, that are, again, emphasizing the genetic etiology, the causation, a single gene leading to a disease that can then be treated. So the argument I'm wanting to make is a set of convergent trends. And I think that's been backed up by this shift to what might be called rare disease politics, where we're seeing the continued growth and influence of rare disease patient organizations, which have powerful biosocial identities and effective claims. So about the need to find cures. And that's led to dedicated rare disease policies in many countries. So we now see across Europe a whole series of rare disease frameworks and policies that governments now paying increasingly attention to, and an increasing influence of patient organizations in the pharmaceutical sector. I'm very struck by attending pharmaceutical meetings at the moment by how patient groups are absolutely central to many of the discussions. about regulatory change, about clinical development, the whole direction of the industry, and increasingly patient groups becoming involved in drug development, particularly rare disease patient groups. So I want to argue that there's been this expansion of this monogenic regime, if you like, that started off in classical clinical genetics associated with rare conditions, through these new accounts of rare variants in common disease etiology. So that's trying to account for this missing heritability, trying to account for the role of genetic factors in common diseases. It's emphasizing these rare variants. I think there's a growing number of tests and therapies for these rare diseases. An increasing percentage of the population perhaps is being diagnosed as having a rare disease. It may not be a major rare disease. It may be, you know, we could take tests and we're saying at risk of having, because of having a particular rare variant, of increased chance of getting a condition or whatever. But this narrative around the causal role of these rare variants, I think, is starting to become a central part of the narratives in contemporary genomics. The massive industrial investment in orphan products that's been going on for some time now, particularly now in relation to gene therapy, and the rise in the influence of patient groups. And so what I want to argue is that this has led to changes in this monogenic regime of normativity. So there's greater emphasis on access to therapy. So attending the meetings I now go to on orphan products and rare disease patient groups, the access to therapy is absolutely one of the central demands, certainly in advanced developing countries. You know, I think there's a set of caveats there. This is very much an sort of North American, European set of observations. So I don't want to generalize beyond that, but I think there's greater emphasis on access to therapies. And I think new normative discourses about the rights for patients who have these diseases to life, in particular their children's lives, because most of these diseases affect children. And the right to access to a cure. So where a drug is on the market, then getting access to it, timely access to it, affordable access to that. And I think a set of new ethical imperatives and obligations are now being articulated to find a cure and ensure access to save lives. So in terms of these notions of genetic responsibility, I want to argue that we're seeing new discourses, new collective responsibilities for families, for patient groups, for companies and policymakers. And the techno-moral imaginary about the future is about cures for all. So cures, the ideal is that articulated in these communities is that people with rare diseases have a right to a cure, and that is being articulated in various rights discourses. And so I've just got a few sort of screen grabs here of some of these rights-based and responsibility-based narratives that I think are being linked to ideas of hope and innovation. And I think what's really striking is that how technological innovation within the pharmaceutical sector is now seen as the way forwards for solving these issues, and the industry is articulating its responsibility to finding those cures. Now, we can be cynical about those in terms of these discourses, but in terms of the shift in, if you like, in these discourses around responsibility, I think they're very significant. And I want to argue this represents a shift from biological to therapeutic citizenship. And we can talk about this more in Q&A. So Rosa Novus, so I'm delighted Carlos is here as a discussant, articulated this idea of biological citizenship, particularly in relationship to, in the first instance, Huntington's disease, the rare patient organization that had a new collective biosocial identity in which rights and responsibilities were articulated in terms of genetic ideas of the body and disease etiology. And this idea of therapeutic citizenship, first articulated by Nguyen in relationship to HIV, is about how individuals living with a disease appropriate therapy as a set of rights to therapy and responsibilities for self-care. And so what I'm arguing, and I think this is, this is a hypothesis, is that we're seeing a shift now in this monogenic regime from one which is concerned primarily with, if you like, diagnostics. I'm not saying that's gone away, but I think it's now being complemented very significantly by these new notions of responsibility to find a cure and to give access to medicines, and that those are moving from an individual to a collective sense of responsibility. And that coincides fundamentally with the emergence of these new ideas about the role of rare variants in disease etiology, the introduction of whole genome sequencing to enable the search for that, but I think especially the increasing role of the pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical companies in rare disease drug discovery, and the power also, the rising power, if you like, of rare disease patient organizations to articulate these new rights and responsibilities within this space in relationship to access to medicines. So, so I think there's an agenda for research here. I'm fundamentally an empirical researcher. So to what extent are we seeing these new discourses of responsibility amongst patients, groups, patient organizations, companies, and policymakers? So is this notion of a right to therapy or this notion of therapeutic citizenship actually occurring? So I think that is an empirical question. How can this concept of therapeutic citizenship be elaborated in this context? And are these developments extending beyond rare diseases? Now, I think this is really absolutely critical. I am not convinced about that. I don't think we're seeing a sort of renaissance in highly geneticized accounts of common diseases in any simplistic way. I think, you know, these will be much more complicated, the multifactorial, complex accounts that are being given. But I think within the rare disease space, I'm arguing that's been expanded very significantly by new technical developments, but also by these other factors. So I just want to plug my penultimate slide. This is a new project. So one of the things that I'm doing is this major research project on orphan drugs funded by the Wellcome Trust. I can talk more about it if people are interested. But that's looking at this relationship between industrial dynamics, the politics of high orphan drug prices, and patient groups and new models of drug innovation. So that's trying to understand and untangle and analyze this relationship between technical change, the role of industry, patient groups, and these new normative claims, as well as the way in which these technologies and developments are being governed. So it's trying to look in the round at these things as they co-evolve over time. So in conclusion, I want to make a really strong plea that normativities co-evolve with sociotechnical change. So we can't divorce the broader development of these new technologies, these new infrastructures, new platforms, and ways of in which innovation is proceeding from the norms, beliefs, expectations that are sort of govern and shape their creation and deployment. And the idea of geneticization and genomic responsibility are embedded in what I've called this monogenic regime. So when we talk about genetic responsibility, I would still argue that it's fundamentally linked to these ideas of genetic etiology, so in which genes are linked to causing disease, and that is the fundamental area, and that is primarily restricted to, you know, this. You know, we can debate the extent to which this is true or not, but to restrict it to talking about rare diseases in the main, or rare variants that are responsible for common diseases. So, and that the regime is changing, so technological innovation is co-evolving these new normative discourses and the entry of actors into that domain. And we're seeing the shift from genetic individual responsibility as very clearly articulated to Kin and you know, within the previous talks, I think, to these new collective obligations to find a cure for these diseases. So I think that's highly speculative in some ways, what I talked about, and I look forward to hearing what Carl's got to say and other people have got to say.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Carlos, we're ready for you. Feel free to share your screen and.
All right. So I'll begin. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in this conference today. And it's really been great hearing the discussions that we've been having today. I also want to thank Paul Martin, both for sharing his paper in advance of his talk today and that forthcoming paper that is going to be published in New Genetics and Society. And so I think, what I'm really happy with in terms of Paul's talk today is that he gave a really detailed discussion of the history of genetic counseling and genetic testing, and especially thinking about this monogenic regime of associated with genetics. And in terms of framing my discussion of Paul's work today, well, I want to really begin by focusing on sort of this concept of the regime of normativity and why I think that's a very significant concept for a number of reasons. And then I'll address the topic that we've been addressed to focus upon, which is how notions of responsibility found to measure up to the original concerns about geneticization. So I think why this concept of regime of normativity is important is its temporality. And so as we can see from Paul's presentation, he developed this historical account of the movement of this regime of normative associated with monogenic diseases to the sort of nascent emergence of a new regime of normativity associated around rare diseases, access to therapies, and parents' right to have a healthy genetically related child. And so I think what this does is it really offers us this real historical or historicity of ethics in relationship to emerging technological systems. So, as Paul pointed out in the case of STS, we like to think of both, ethics, science, technology, and society as being co-produced. And so I would say that within the field of STS, this idiom of co-production has been quite essential over the past 20 years. And I think the reason why it's so important is it allows us to see, societies as dynamic, as constantly changing, constantly evolving over the course of time. And so, thinking more specifically about ethics, when we think about this temporality of regimes of normativity, it allows us to see ethical principles, codes, and guidelines in relation to particular scientific and technological developments as temporary stabilizations rather than something that is timeless or universal. I guess the second thing that I really like about Paul's analysis of regimes of normativity is this has this sort of pluralist conception built in within this conception, and it really allows us to see the role of different social actors in developing ethics, norms, and guidelines in relationship to science and technological development. So if we think about Paul's analysis, he brought into a number of different actors who shape this regime of normativity, from states, regulators, scientists, academics, think tanks, patients groups, laypersons. And so I think in this concept of regimes of normativity, we can see how it can also extend beyond national boundaries, especially in the paper he's developed for New Genetics and Society, where we see consensus in some topics between the United States, Europe, and the UK. And so what I think is important about this concept is that it enables us to expand the range of actors who are considered to be involved and have a stake in deliberating norms, guidelines, and ethical principles in relationship to scientific and technological developments. I think, and this especially came out, I think, in Stina and in Kimberly's comments, is I think that the other thing that's important about these regimes of normativity is it really enables us to think about the importance of a local or national context in shaping and framing ethical debates. So if we think about the example of the UK, which I'm more familiar with, we can think about the importance of the role of institutions such as the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, the role of the Wellcome Trust, to name a few UK examples. So while there is this pluralism of different actors that have an influence on policy, we can also think about the institutional importance of certain actors that help to frame frame, shape debate, and inform policy discussion, and of course, provide funding to a number of researchers so we can go out and do more kinds of stuff. I think the other kind of fourth element that I want to bring out of this regime of normativity is the kinds of types of boundary work that take place within these regimes. And oftentimes, and this comes up more in the paper that Paul's doing for New Genetic Society, we can see these distinctions between, say, somatic versus, say, germline engineering as one form of boundary work that happens within the field. Or the therapy versus enhancement distinction that is often used to think about genetic intervention. And I guess thinking about the concept of regime of normativity more within an international relations context, we can also think about states that will sort of choose to have similar aligned beliefs versus actors who are outside of that regime and choose to go their own ways. I think we can also think about within these regimes of normativity, what is kind of sayable and unsayable in terms of thinking about disability rights, some of the heteronormative implications of technologies such as IVF and the like. And so what I want to do now is kind of turn to a more sort of macro level analysis of regimes of normativity. And this is especially in the case that, Paul mentioned that his analysis was more at the meso level. So I want to kind of think about, what he was discussing at a more macro level. And so I think in the case of this, he talked about the evolution of this techno-scientific imaginary and in particular, in relationship to development and increasing routinization of genetic counseling, genetic testing, and whole genome sequencing. And so I would say that in terms of the broader kind of macro level ethos that has informed this regime of normativity is liberal humanism and its individualist conception of rights and responsibilities. Within the context of genetics and biomedical research, this liberal humanist tradition has privileged individual autonomy, informed consent, and choice as key principles informing the development and provision of genetic services. Within the context of genetics, this liberal humanist tradition is often challenged when it has to deal with the familial and population level implications of genetics. So if we think about issues related to autonomy, confidentiality, and privacy, they become complicated in the field of genetics, where individuals are imbricated in family networks that span over several generations and that have broader population consequences, especially when we think about gene therapy. And to complicate matters further, these familiar ties are not only biological, but they're also deeply effective in both the good and bad meaning of these terms of family dynamics, which can often be complicated for multiple reasons. So, turning back to some of the things that Nicholas and I tried to do in the two papers that we wrote together on genetic risk and biological citizenship, we were really trying to question, the kind of neoliberal version of the subject at genetic risk, where individuals are encouraged to be, active in relation to their health, to be prudent, to be knowledgeable, to seek information, and how genetics became, what we were focused on is really thinking about how genetics became this kind of site for ethical self-problematization, where individuals had to, begin to question their responsibility to others, whether to potential marriage partner, the decision to have children, whether to inform other family members of a potential genetic risk. And I'm very glad that, Stina brought up the work of Rainer Rapp, because I think in many ways, the work that Nicholas and I did was very much in line with that of Rainer Rapp, who, developed the term moral pioneers to help us think about, the kinds of complex decision-making that women have to engage in light of developments of prenatal diagnosis and testing. And so, just as a way of drawing to a close, I think that, this liberal humanist understanding of the individual is increasingly being challenged and questioned, especially by feminist and post-humanist scholars who argue that this kind of model of the human was informed by the white European male. And I think, Kimberly began to address that when, she focused on the work of reproductive and disability scholars who are also beginning to question that as well. And, one of the things that I like about the work of post-humanist scholars is that their emphasis on how individuals are embedded in complex sets of relations with both animate and inanimate matter. And I think that this form of thinking helps us to reimagine our relations to human others and with non-human entities. I think that we're starting to witness kind of the emergence of that has also led us to reimagine what social justice can look like, and concerns about the global climate crisis. And then, as Paul outlined in his talk, and I'll agree with Paul in this sense that, many of the original claims around geneticization in the literature, have not come to fruition, or they haven't materialized, as we become increasingly aware of the complexity of disease etiology and the multiple factors that shape the expression of the disease. So, as many empirical accounting, Paul authored that paper with Katie Finder, many individuals have incredibly fuzzy conceptions of genetic causation, and that many clinicians are increasingly seeing genetics as one tool amongst many within their diagnostic arsenal. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Paul, for your presentation.
Okay, so thank you both. I'm going to moderate the next 15 minutes, and I'd like to remind our attendees again that you may ask a question either in the Q&A button, or you may raise your hand and I will call on you. To kick off, Dr. Martin, would you like to reply to Carlos Nova's discussion?
Not really. I mean, I can, but I think it'd be interesting to hear what other people think.
Okay, I am seeing a question from Anna Lewis in the Q&A, and I will read it. Paul, I buy the trends you draw on in focusing us on the monogenic regime of normativity. We're also seeing trends towards common conditions, most notably with polygenic risk scores. Do you see a new separate regime of normativity developing here?
It was interesting. I was thinking about this exact question. I think it's a great question, and one that I'm only just starting to think about. I think that because I'm a bit of a skeptic about all these things, I suppose, we'll see how polygenic risk scores go. But if you think about whole genome sequencing as the technological driver of a whole set of new knowledge about disease etiology at this sort of microgenetic genomic level or whatever, it's not clear how that translates easily into any sort of therapeutic or diagnostic intervention. Polygenic risk scores appear to do that and offer a way around this problem of actually needing to map the causal action of these different sort of genetic elements, which are far too sort of complex. But if you can basically say, collectively that you can combine some sort of risk algorithm to predict genetic risk based on whole genome sequencing, then I think you've got yourself a whole new paradigm in terms of trying to understand disease etiology of common diseases. So I think potentially, yes, you're right to highlight that. And I have to say, I think this is probably one of the most interesting from a social science point of view areas to look at, to see the sort of claims and counterclaims about the validity of polygenic risk scores and how they may be deployed in the clinic.
Very good. Okay, I see a few hands raised. Silke, I am going to unmute you. Actually, I cannot unmute you. Can you unmute yourself, Silke?
Yes, I can unmute myself, obviously. Yeah, thanks a lot. I like to pickpock a bit on Paul's observation, which I found quite remarkable and interesting, is that there is this shift in normativity, or in this regime of normativity, focusing first on collective responsibilities. And you said you think there is now the guiding norm, so to say, is more a language of rights. I'd like to draw your attention perhaps also that it might be not only the language or norm of rights, but even of justice. And I'm saying so because I think the rights terminology still has, at least from a philosophical point of view, a purely I mean, a liberal notion, so to say. But I think what is really interesting when it comes to collectives claiming for being more visible, and I think this is where you were pointing to the rare disease and orphan community. I feel it's really exactly linking what Kim was formerly pointing out, that they use, or that there might be this new occurrence that this was a formerly marginalized group within the healthcare system. And I think this is often an argument also brought forward by ethicists, for example. And so I think, and it makes it perhaps even more tricky also from a critical sociological point of view, that the drive for social justice and for caring more about marginalized groups somehow brings in a shift that in itself can be then critically seen, because it has its own dynamic, so to say. So that was more perhaps an observation, but I would be interested whether you think that also makes sense.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things I'm trying to do at the moment is look at these claims about justice and equity. Inequality will be the language in the UK, and I think it would be very much about these groups feeling they've been marginalised, as you say, in the healthcare system, and their claims to have fair treatment. Of course, this runs up against, in the British context, the health technology assessment done by NICE, and the sort of price that's put on a QALY, so on essentially on a life, and how actually these rare disease therapies turn out to be very expensive per life. And so you're getting into a whole load of complications here about how much is a life worth, claims of justice. And then you have people in health economics who say basically that these are exceptionalist claims that are not fully valid, because basically, you know, they're displacing other claims for people who need hip replacements or community care or whatever, by making these very powerful, effective narratives about the lives of children, but essentially, which are very hard from a critical point of view to sort of to counter. I'm not arguing that we should. So I think you're right. I think that claims of justice and marginalization are absolutely central to the biopolitics here.
Very good. We have another hand up, this time from Paul. Paul, if you would unmute yourself, because I can't do it on my end.
I am unmuted. Thank you, Lucas. So, and thank you, Paul, for what I thought was an extremely interesting talk. We, through our center, are currently funded to do a series of interviews, which we're in the middle of now, with parents of children with rare diseases, rare genetic mutations, as well as clinical geneticists, and we'll ultimately be interviewing IRB, Research Ethics Committee, members as well. And one of the things that has struck me so far that I think echoes what you're suggesting, although you can, I'd be interested in your reflections on it, is the near unanimity that we've heard from both parents and geneticists. When we ask, you know, we point out these are very expensive treatments that will only potentially be useful if they work for one or a very small number of people, usually children. Who do you think should pay for that? Now, you know, in many parts of the world, the answer would be obvious. The national health system should pay for it. We don't have a national health system, and yet the answer that's fairly consistently given is the government should pay for it. And so there's an assumption. I mean, part of what I think is inherent in a rights discourse is that rights can't be trumped, right? You can't trade off rights. You can't compromise rights. Rights are absolute. And the notion of a limited pool of money, difficult allocation decisions, perhaps better uses in terms of the number of people who can be helped or the number of lives that can be saved for equivalent amounts of money spent in other places seems not to enter the picture the dominant perspective is in fact, well, of course, somebody has to do this, and the only entity with the money to do this sort of thing is the government. So of course, the government should pay for it. So not only would I be interested to hear more about your project as it unfolds, but I'd be interested in your reflections on that.
I think you're right, and we're seeing the sort of collision of different sort of both sort of rationales in terms of these sort of claims. But I say, I think what's really strikes me, so I've been to some of the political meetings in the House of Commons, in Parliament, where rare disease patient organisations, families who've lost children, make very, very powerful, I say, effective claims to resources and to justice and to essentially finances through the National Health Service, and that has real political clout. And so the way in which these claims are starting to, I wouldn't say overly influence, but certainly sort of shape some of the debates about health technology assessment in the UK are very significant. So I think for some of the rare disease patient organisations, though, I think you're right, they're always going to be looking towards collective forms of payment rather than individual ones, and that means the states, certainly in European healthcare systems. I think the other alternative, though, is to look at new models of drug innovation. And that's where I think drug repurposing and patient-led coalitions that are trying to essentially reduce the cost of creating these new medicines. So there's a number of sort of small companies being set up, often by patient organizations or patients who are looking to essentially change the way in which drug innovation works so that they can massively reduce the cost using these drugs that are already licensed, if you like, using artificial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we want to focus on now is these new initiatives which are trying to change, if you like, the economic dynamics and calculations made and the way in which patient groups are making new claims to resources and to drug innovation, sort of the rights to develop these drugs in regulatory systems. I think that's a really interesting development. And if you like, one way out of what might be seen as a zero-sum game.
Okay, we have a question in Q&A from Bob Klitzman. There doesn't seem to have been much acknowledgement of the possibility that monogenetic regime has thus far proved wrong. Do you see, or would you expect any more recognition of the faltering of this prior paradigm?
So a lot of my career has been spent talking about the sort of sociology of expectations. So this is very much about the way in which assumptions and imaginaries about technological progress shape innovation, shape sort of clinical practice, et cetera, et cetera. And I would argue that until very recently, I felt that the whole monogenic paradigm, this attempt to expand the paradigm into common diseases, has just not gone anywhere in any real significant way. Maybe I'm being a bit simplistic about that. And I think that the continued belief in genetic causation for complex diseases is testimony to that. I have to say, in psychiatry or whatever, I'm deeply skeptical about any simplistic genetic narrative about the role of genes in psychiatric disorders, for example. I'm not saying that biological factors don't matter. I'm not saying that. But I think this attempt to sort of have this genetic paradigm, and I think there's a danger in sometimes saying, oh, the problem is the public understanding of these things, simplistic ideas. I'd say the reason that people have simplistic ideas is often because they've been essentially fed those one way or another by scientists, scientific pioneers at different sorts of points in time, and the media. And there's a very complex cultural dynamic going on in how these expectations are created. So I think, in 20 or 30 years' time, when the dust is sort of settling on these things, the role of genetic factors in common diseases will be seen as very complicated and not at all deterministic.
Very good. We don't have any other questions in the queue. I'll pose one for either Paul or Carlos. This is open. One thing that I have felt to be one of the major innovations of genomics is the application of genetic testing for non-medical traits. And when I think about your model of the regime of normativity, it does seem to be historically defined in disease-related research. And I'm wondering if the transition to genetic testing for things like educational attainment changes the picture at all, or does it apply equally well to non-medical or disease-related traits?
I mean, Carlos can maybe say something about this in a minute. I suppose I'm extremely skeptical about the validity, if you like, in the long run of those claims around these tests. So, you know, I might be proved wrong, but you know, if that's based on polygenic risk scores, which I think many of them are, you know, we shall see. I think that's still a highly contested science technically within the academic community. And I think it's going to be some way before we actually have a stable sort of discourse and set of technologies and practices around that. But I don't know if Carlos has got any reflections on that.
Yeah, I would say most of my research focuses on genetic testing for diseases, which I think, you know, we can, and oftentimes, you know, very clear, you know, genetic autosomal dominant or very clear genetic inheritance. So that's what I can mostly speak to in terms of my expertise. And, you know, very similar to Paul, you know, I'm very skeptical and worried when we begin, you know, applying genetics to things such as educational attainment, you know, things like alcoholism, criminality. That's when I start to get really worried about the potential implications of genetics. And I think it's much better to really, you know, focus on disease causation and focus on genetic testing on those kinds of instances where there is a clear connection between disease and genes.
You know, I should add that I share that skepticism as well. But I do get the impression that if we're thinking about how the underlying technology and the use of the concepts influences our normativity about genetics, and these tests are available, this research is being done, regardless of its validity, it's a part of history, it's a part of what's going on, and it seems like it should be a part of the picture in how we characterize it. Yeah,
I mean, you know, I don't disagree with that. I have to say, in the UK, those developments are very much in their infancy and are highly contested. So perhaps that's something more that we need to, scholars in the UK need to pay a bit more attention to what's going on in the States. So I think you're right. I mean, if those claims start to be, you know, gain traction, regardless of what we think about their validity or not, then the promises of that technology and the normativity association have consequences. They're performative. And, you know, I think then that has to be taken very seriously. But I think at the moment, that's not something I pay much attention to. So I think it's something I'll come out of the meeting with. I will talk to you more about that.
sure, excellent. We have, no, we're about out of time here. So thank you again. Let's thank our speakers virtually. And we will transition to the final wrap-up discussion with Kathryn Tabb.
Hi, everyone. So my aim here is to present some thoughts I've been thinking during the course of the day to hopefully kick off some kind of discussion. But I really want to encourage members of the audience as I'm speaking to get your thoughts in order about any overarching themes that you would like to hear more about from all of our speakers before we close for today. And also for our speakers, if you have questions for other speakers that you didn't get to, let's all just be thinking. I think I want to start with a question that Dr. Coy threw out a while ago about the specificity of our discussion today, about the specificity of responsibility in relation to genetics, as opposed to our thinking about responsibility more broadly. And I think this question about whether we need to think about responsibility differently in the context of genetics than in similar, more traditional contexts, like just thinking about heredity or human similarity, things like that. And then also thinking about responsibility just generally as a philosophical concept is a really important one. And I think from our very first talk today, that's been hovering in the background here. So I heard 3 reasons that I want to highlight for thinking that there is something very specific about genetics in relation to responsibility. The first is maybe just the obvious one, that genetics has specific mechanisms by which it works. So the way that it will exert control or not over human beings will be different from other kinds of control. But I think, as was highlighted in that final exchange in the last Q&A, and also as people have been referencing throughout the day, this specificity is for the most part theoretical rather than concrete for us with relation to many of the behavioral traits that we really care about. However, I think that as our knowledge in behavioral genetics increases, the specificity of our explanations will only expand. So we need to anticipate that. A second place where I think we need to be concerned about the specificity of genetics vis-a-vis responsibility has to do with the intersectional implications of popular thinking about responsibility in genetics, as we heard from Dr. Murchison's, I think, very crucial intervention here. So this sort of specificity grows out of the way that racist structures in medicine and in science have shaped our discourse, as well as the history of eugenical violence towards those with disabilities, which makes the moral questions in this realm, I think, very particular. And then a third thing that I heard that I think is worth highlighting is that even if in some ways genetics is a stand-in for other concepts among lay people and maybe some professionals these days, if maybe it's standing in for something like inheritance more generally, or something like human essence, or something like that part of us that's determined, it still might have a specificity. So there might be some concept of what the genetic is that's featuring in the public imaginary or in the minds of scientists or clinicians that we need to be responding to carefully and thoughtfully. Okay, so given all that, it seems like there does need to be a particular rhetoric for thinking about responsibility in relation to genetics. And the question, of course, is like, what is that rhetoric? How do we want to shape it? How do we want to think about it? One important theme that I saw emerging, I think especially from Dr. Parker's comments, also from Dr. Applebaum's early in the morning, is the thought that it's not going to fall out of the science, right? So even if our behavioral genetics gets better, even if we have explanations that we can have more confidence in, it will not be clear what that means for our thinking about our own responsibility for our own traits that are caused by our genes, our responsibility towards others, given the genes that they have inherited. These are normative questions. And one fallout of the work that Dr. Applebaum described that he and I completed along with Matt Lebowitz is that people seem to think in ways that may appear irrational about genetics if we expect them to respond purely on the basis of the science. So in our research, we saw that people respond asymmetrically when they think about the repercussions of people having genes for pro-social or antisocial behavior. And we may expect that insofar as having a gene for pro-social behavior or antisocial behavior, each would determine your behavior to a similar extent. We may think that people should think that responsibility will accord equally to those different sorts of traits. Sorry, there's a siren. And we found that that wasn't true. And Dr. Heifetz, in her comment, encouraged us to think carefully about these kinds of differences, that it may really depend on the context, how people, what people's intuitions are about the relationship between genetics and responsibility. And I want to suggest that I think that may not be irrational at all. That may just be the fact that what is really shaping people's intuitions is not scientific information, but rather their longstanding norms and modes of thinking about moral responsibility. So if that's right, then I think we need to be careful when we think that the answer is always more scientific literacy. It may be that people learning more about how genetics mechanisms function simply won't help, because what we actually need is more careful ethical thinking. I don't know that I think that's true, but I think we should all be asking that question about kind of which arena it's appropriate to intervene in here. And I want to emphasize by that, I don't mean to suggest that the facts of the matter about genetics are irrelevant here. And I think this came through very beautifully in Dr. Martin's remarks, that what is going on in the science will always affect the kind of regimes that we use to think and live with genetics. I think another very potent example of this right now is precision medicine, where the virtue of precision has started shaping people's ideals about explanation in a way that I think has major implications for medical ethics. And then, yeah, finally, I just wanted to say how much I liked Anna Lewis's question for one of our speakers about what kind of response we would like families and other service users to have when they receive genetic information. I think we don't ask this question enough, and I think it's a very interesting way to kind of invert some of the discussion that we commonly have on this topic. If we started with answering that question of what would be the ideal response, I think what we will see pretty quickly is I don't think we really know. I mean, those of us who work in this field and think about this all the time, I don't think we really know. And I think it's because a lot of the information that's communicated when genetic information is communicated is not actionable. It's not actionable even in the kind of nebulous realm of our self-concept or of how we treat others. I think we ourselves, and by that I mean scientists, I mean theoreticians, I mean clinicians, are ambivalent often about what the significance of this kind of knowledge is. So I just wanted to highlight that as I think a very helpful way to think about approaching this question and kind of reverse engineering from what we think would be a sort of healthy response to this kind of information. I do think that one thing we can say, coming away from these talks, is that I think a consensus formed over the course of the day that we want to discourage a kind of individualism, that when people receive genetic information and think about it purely in terms of themselves and their lives, they are missing a broader social context where genetic information increasingly has a kind of alarming degree of power and where decisions really matter for people beyond the individual. So I will stop there and invite any of our panelists to chime in or anyone in the audience to ask a question. Yes, okay.
Yeah, perhaps I can start this final panel discussion by picking up your point about the specificities of genetics. And I have 2 points, also depending, informed, so to say, by the discussion we had today, but also, of course, about of the amount of empirical research that has been done in the last decade on the different areas. So the first of all, my personal observation is that that many things we have discussed here might be not so specific for genetics, but we might or also should be sensitive to other areas in medicine, especially what is so-called personalized medicine, where this trend of having biomarkers providing risk scores based on neurological blood markers, information, blah, 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 all these type, I think I would expect, and also part of our own research on neurological biomarkers, for example, and physiological biomarkers in predicting dementia, somehow indicates that there are a lot of parallels of what we have discussed today. So that's one thing. So still, I think there might be the question whether there still remains something super specific about genetics. I would not deny, but brings me to another point is somehow I feel a bit uncomfortable about the genetics, because I feel that the many studies that have been conducted empirically, but also theoretically, often focus on a broad field of diseases, and all these diseases, or where genetics is developed as diagnostics, or now even part of treatment or therapeutic approaches, I think you always have history and the cultural context of the diseases where this type of genetics pops up, so to say. And I feel that it really is crucial always to have this cultural historical context of a disease in mind when we talk about genetics responsibilities and the involved actors, whether they are individuals, families, professions, or institutions. And this somehow, so to say, is a play for having always the comparative eye, so to say, on how these questions play out in different fields of application.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you think then about Lucas's final question about as you know, and I think our last two speakers mirror the sentiments of many of us in saying that this might be a hypothetical worry, but if genetics proves itself useful in moving beyond explaining our pathologies and into explaining other aspects of our character, to what extent then we need a different discourse, given the historical grounding in disease that you just emphasized?
So you mean if we have kind of scientific evidence or that genetics cause or is the only cause for all the diseases we have? Or I'm not
well, so,
really...
so Lucas brought up the use of genetics and thinking about educational attainment and success. Hi, Lucas.
Hi.
Do you want to expand on that?
Sure, yeah. One of the big things that I've been tracking in my research is the application of polygenic testing to non-medical traits. So they've done genome-wide association studies of the number of years of schooling a person completes in their life, or household income, a range of non-medical traits that now you can provide to the public genetic information about how maybe genes influences these behaviors. And it seems to me to be a new domain, a new application of genetics that I believe likely raises new questions.
Okay, yeah, now I got it. Yeah, but then again, I think I would just like to transfer my observation that also the way how we understand education is, I think, very culturally framed. I mean, how we think it's important, what is it a factor to make your life, to be successful, and so on. Should it be a relevant factor or not? And then I think I also just share Martin's, Paul's observation, sorry, that I think also in Germany there's no debate. So I think it's, again, I would say, isn't it again interesting that this seems to be a specific North American issue, perhaps? And what does it tell us? This is my European perspective on that discourse.
Paul, do you want to jump in? Paul Martin?
I don't want to, I mean, I'll maybe come back to this specific point in a second, but I'm interested in what people feel, the panel feels about what I would regard as the most significant sort of structural change that's going on, and that's the massive expansion of data coming from whole genome sequencing. So maybe this is a particular UK perspective, but it's just been announced today that the government are going to integrate on an opt-out basis all the medical records in the NHS for patients. I've not followed the story, I only heard it about an hour ago. So, but this is an attempt to go back, something they've been trying to do for a while, which is build this massive database of integrated genomic and personal medical information. And I know in Denmark that there are other sort of fantasies sort of around aspects of that. Maybe this is more a European thing because of the national health services. But I think what we're going to see with the expansion of whole genome sequencing is this enormous amount of genomic data out there. Now, what exactly that means, I don't know. I'm not making any claims per se, but I think that's going to be the big game changer structurally, is that we're going to have a lot more of this data floating around, and there's going to be all sorts of claims then made. And I think polygenic risk scores, that question that was asked about is there going to be a new regime of normativity around that? I think these claims about educational attainment are just the first sign of the broadest cultural and social significance of that massive expansion of this type of data, all sorts of ways in which that's going to be mined and exploited for different purposes. So I just wonder if people feel that that is something, maybe, you know, from a North American perspective, it'd be interesting to see if you think that's coming down the track, but certainly from the UK perspective, that is foursquare and central to public health policy in the UK in terms of the future imaginary of where the whole healthcare system is going. It's going to have genomic data everywhere. And so I think these narratives around the responsibility will be reshaped in the light of that.
Yeah, there's also another sense of responsibility that we didn't talk about so much today that was just brought up in the chat by somebody who wrote, given the recent HSE hack in Ireland, what could possibly go wrong if we save genetic data in a national database? So there's an additional form of responsibility that that our state institutions have around privacy and control. Did anyone want to weigh in on Paul's question about, especially, I think it's interesting in the comparative transatlantic context to think about this. Lucas, did you want to?
Well, I actually wanted to follow up on the comment from the anonymous attendee, but it does connect with Paul's point about whole genome sequencing producing so much new and very large amounts of data. A related issue that's happened with the UK Biobank is the access of genomic data by race-oriented researchers who are investigating questions that the behavior genetics community at large believes are not valid and not worth asking. But it's part of having open science. It's part of having large genomic databases that is giving rise to some controversial scientific research, and that can also connect to responsibility and what sort of responsibilities we have as research scientists to funnel the sort of questions that get asked. Yeah, that's all I had there.
We also have a question, general question from Bob Glitzman in the chat about precision medicine and about whether it is being oversold, and if so, what we should do or say. Paul, I'm sure you have thoughts about this. Anyone want to?
I mean, I'm sure it's been a bit oversold, but I suppose I think again, coming from the UK perspective, what's really striking is the persistence of this genomic imaginary in policy over 20 or 30 years, in which genetic causation of disease is absolutely central to it. It's now articulated through this notion of precision medicine or whatever. But I think it's sometimes not clear to me what's sort of driving that. I mean, clearly in the oncology field, I think we can see real progress being made in disease stratification and the way that's cashing out in terms of therapeutic advances. But beyond that, I'm, skeptical. I think we have to call for a strong evidence base for these things to be introduced. And I think that's easier in some countries than others. In the context of where you have strong HTA regimes, that becomes possible. But I have to say there's all sorts of ways now in which exceptions are being made to that through exemptions, accelerated access programs, things like that. So yeah, I think it's a real conundrum. I can't quite tell exactly where all the momentum's coming from. It is not just simply commercial. I think there's a lot of investment in the scientific community in the idea of stratified or precision medicine. So I just think, more open debate about how effective it is in reality, and questioning some of these claims is going to be the way forwards.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. One reason I see the for maybe being careful about seeing precision as just a synonym for genomic is that the power of that term to get things done, that is to get science funded, I think is showing itself on a few different fronts. So in the United States, precision is now, or was, I mean, things are changing, but in the early part of the early years of the 21st century was the term of choice within psychiatry. So the NIMH, when they introduced the research domain criteria project, this new kind of attempt to wrestle control away from the DSM in our thinking about psychiatric explanation, they called that precision psychiatry. But they weren't referring to psychiatric genetics, which they've all, more or less lost hope in. They were referring to neuroscience. And so Thomas Insel introduced this idea that psychiatry just should be clinical neuroscience or applied neuroscience, and used the language of precision for that. So I think the word itself has taken on a kind of power, even abstracted away from genetics. There's another question in the chat, kind of going back to this earlier interest in responsibility in the sense of the protection of private information. So this attendee writes, given how prevalent the push for, as Paul said, genomic data everywhere, how easy will it be to opt out of genetic data collection? Would anyone like to speak to this concern? Yes, look.
I can just speak about my observations here in Germany. And it's interesting that in particular, Germany is often very strong when it comes to data protection law, at least in comparative terms. However, I think it will become less and less possible, so to say, to opt out, because also here, and I think that there's this ongoing debate in bioethics, there is this idea to replace informed consent by broad consent, to use clinical data for all kinds of data-driven research. And even if their existing consent, forms point out that genomic data has a specific meaning, there's a specificity about this. I think it's so impact and integrated in this whole process. I'm quite sure that a lot of people are not able, so to say, to opt out, even if there is this kind of option, so to say, in the informed consent. But just speaking in practical terms, people have to sign such forms often under time pressure, and so I think it will be more like there will be a legal option to opt out, but I think socially it will be less and less practical, and this concerns me very much. And this is why I'm also very critical towards this idea of broad consent, for example.
So let me offer a somewhat different perspective on that, which ends up, I think, in the same place, which is we don't have to imagine government coercion to for broad scale genetic data collection, right? For some purposes that exists already here in the United States. Felons and many misdemeanants who are arrested have mandatory collection of their genetic samples. Migrants who come into the country illegally can be forced to provide DNA samples for their tracking as well. But I think that's going to remain the minority of cases. What's going to happen, what is happening, is that the medical care system in increasingly switching over to a genetic paradigm of illness and perhaps, as I think Paul was suggesting, treatment, is simply going to demand of its patients to voluntarily provide the samples that will allow medical treatment as it is becoming to be conceptualized to take place. So you'll go to your physician, your specialist, or your primary care physician, and he or she will say, okay, now we're going to draw your cholesterol level, your blood lipid level, and a variety of electrolytes just to see how you're doing. And of course, I'm a little worried about that wheeze you have, and we're going to work that up by genotyping you for some of the common variants that are associated with asthma and chronic pulmonary conditions. You could say no, but the fact of the matter is no one does in that circumstance. And the failure to say no will mean that we will continuously build and expand the data set available about all of us that exists within the medical treatment system. That may then go on to be used for research, either because broad consent is obtained or because those data are de-identified. And in many systems, including the American system, de-identified data can be used without patients' consent, given certain kinds of regulatory approvals. So it's going to happen, but I don't think it's going to happen in a nefarious way. It's going to happen in the context of a benevolent system that nonetheless is going to ultimately have all our genetic information interoperably linked and available for good purposes, but potentially for bad ones as well.
Eric, did you want to chime in here?
I wanted to thank you, Katie. I don't want to prematurely end us, but that's why we're getting close. Yeah. Let's see if there's another question before I thank you and everyone else.
Well, we have a question in the chat. We have a hand up also, which I think came first, from Ellen Clayton. Ellen, do you want to unmute? Okay.
No, I was going to say, I mean, Paul is right about the information being in the healthcare system. That actually has some protections, not great, but some. The big issue is the directed consumer genetic testing, which is more than 30 million people in this country, which is almost twice as many as what's in the criminal justice system, with much more information, and that you have no control over, because your relatives can all do this, and once they're in it, you're in it. So it's really quite a big issue. So I would say yes, health system, research less so, because that's better protected. But the elephant in the middle of the room is the directed consumer genetic testing. So now I'll be quiet.
All right, well, maybe that's a good place to draw things to a close, Eric.
Wow, that was an incredible day of talks. Thank you, Katie, for the wonderful synthesis. Thank you to all of the speakers for really just beautifully organized, clear talks. I feel incredibly lucky to be part of a conversation that includes psychologists and philosophers and anthropologists and sociologists. It's just remarkable. It is quite a privilege. So I'm grateful to have had it today. Thank you all. I hope everybody has a terrific weekend. And unless anybody else on the panel needs to say anything else, why don't we say thank you?
I need to say something else. I think we all owe you, Eric, and the organizing committee our thanks for putting this whole thing together, which we know took a lot of work to pull off in the smoothness with which the day went, and as terrific as the talks were, is all a result of the amount of effort and coordination that went into this in advance. So thank you and the other members of the organizing committee.
Thank you. It was very much a team effort. Alas, one team member, Ruth Ottman, is I think on the call, but not present. She's in California. Yes, it was a group effort. Thanks to all. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Be well. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.